When I attended my sister's birthday dinner, my seat was at the kids' table. BIL Smirked. Only important guests sit with the adults. Worse, there was no plate for me. Sister shrugged. Guess you're not that important. I stood up, took my gift, and said, then I'm leaving. Sister froze. I, 32M, walked into my sister's house last Saturday carrying a beautifully wrapped gift that cost me 3 weeks of overtime. The scent of her favorite lasagna filled the air, and I could hear laughter from the dining room. After driving 4 hours to be here for her 35th birthday, I expected at least a warm welcome. Instead, I got pointed toward a plastic table in the corner where my 8-year-old nephew was coloring and my teenage niece was scrolling through her phone. My brother-in-law stood near the main dining table, adjusting place cards with that satisfied smirk he always wore when he thought he was being clever. He looked up as I approached, his eyes gleaming with something that made my stomach turn. He told me only important guests sit with the adults, his voice dripping with condescension. The room fell silent for a moment before conversations resumed, but I caught the uncomfortable glances from other family members. I stared at the kids' table, then at the main dining room where aunts, uncles, and family friends were settling into their seats. Even my sister's co-workers from the bank had spots at the adult table. But me? Her only brother? I got relegated to sit between a juice box and a coloring book. My sister emerged from the kitchen carrying her famous garlic bread, the same recipe our grandmother taught us both. She surveyed the seating arrangement, and I waited for her to fix this obvious mistake. Instead, she shrugged and said I probably wasn't that important anyway, as if my presence at her birthday dinner was some kind of charity case. The gift in my hands suddenly felt heavier. Inside that elegant wrapping was a vintage necklace I'd spent months tracking down, the same one she'd admired in our grandmother's jewelry box years ago. The same one she cried about wanting when Grandma passed away last year. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room turn toward me. The conversations died down to whispers. My teenage niece looked up from her phone for the first time all evening, sensing something was about to happen. Without a word, I tucked the gift under my arm and headed toward the door. My sister called after me, asking where I was going. I told her since I wasn't important enough for a proper seat, I was leaving. The confidence in her voice cracked just slightly when she said I was being dramatic. But I was already at the front door, car keys in hand. The drive home gave me 4 hours to think about how we'd gotten to this point. Growing up, we were inseparable. When Dad left when I was 12 and she was 15, we promised we'd always have each other's backs. When she struggled through college, I worked double shifts at the restaurant to help with her expenses. When she met her future husband, I welcomed him into our small family with open arms. But over the past 3 years, things had changed. Her husband came from money, the kind of family that owned multiple properties and took annual trips to Europe. Slowly, my sister began adopting their attitudes about success and status. Phone calls became shorter. Invitations became rarer. When they bought their house in the affluent part of town, I barely saw her anymore. Still, I'd hoped family meant something. Apparently, I was wrong. The next morning, my phone buzzed with texts from various relatives who'd witnessed the dinner debacle. My aunt said she was appalled by how I'd been treated. My uncle mentioned he'd left shortly after I did, disgusted by the whole situation. Even my sister's coworker texted to say she felt uncomfortable watching it unfold. But nothing from my sister. Not an apology, not an explanation. Nothing. 3 days later, she finally called. She demanded to know why I'd embarrassed her at her birthday dinner. I reminded her that she was the one who'd embarrassed me, treating me like a second-class relative in front of everyone we knew. She insisted I was overreacting, that it was just seating arrangements, nothing personal. I asked her how she'd feel if I seated her at the kids' table at my wedding someday. The line went quiet for a long moment before she hung up. Update 1. 2 weeks after the birthday disaster, my sister's attitude toward me became the talk of our extended family. Word spread quickly about how she'd treated me, and not everyone was impressed with her new social climbing tendencies. My cousin called to tell me about a family group chat I wasn't part of, where several relatives had expressed their disappointment in my sister's behavior. Apparently, her husband had been bragging about putting me in my place, as if humiliating family members was some kind of achievement. But the real shock came when my grandmother's lawyer contacted me. After Grandma passed, her will had specified that her jewelry collection would be divided between my sister and me when we both turned 30. Since my sister was already 35 and I'd just turned 32, it was time to distribute the pieces. Here's what my sister didn't know. Grandma had made a codicil to her just months before she died. She'd grown concerned about my sister's changing personality and her husband's influence over her. The codicil stated that if there was evidence of one beneficiary treating the other poorly, the jewelry would go entirely to the wrong party. Our aunt, who'd been present at the birthday dinner, had already spoken with the lawyer about what she'd witnessed. Combined with statements from other family members who'd seen my sister's treatment of me over the past year, the lawyer felt there was sufficient evidence to honor the codicil. I found myself inheriting the entire collection, including that vintage necklace my sister had always wanted, the same one I'd planned to surprise her with at the birthday dinner. The irony wasn't lost on me. If she'd simply treated me with basic respect, she would have received the necklace as a gift and still inherited half the collection. Instead, her cruelty cost her everything. When the lawyer contacted her to inform her of the decision, she immediately called me, screaming about fighting it in court. I calmly reminded her that she'd made it clear I wasn't important enough to sit at her table, so surely I wasn't important enough to share Grandma's jewelry with either. She threatened to contest the will, but her husband quickly shut down that idea when he learned about the legal fees involved. Apparently, his family's money came with strings attached, and frivolous lawsuits weren't approved expenses. Update 2. A month later, my sister's marriage hit its first major rough patch. Her husband's family had been planning their annual charity gala, the kind of event where social status mattered more than the actual cause. My sister had been looking forward to it for months, seeing it as her introduction into their high society circle. But when the guest list was finalized, she discovered she hadn't made the cut. Her husband's mother had politely explained that only family members with established social standing would be attending. After the birthday dinner incident became gossip fodder among their social circle, my sister's reputation had taken a hit. Apparently, treating family poorly reflected badly on one's character, and my brother-in-law's family valued their reputation above all else. My sister found herself in the same position I'd been in, deemed not important enough for the main event. The realization hit her hard. She'd sacrificed her relationship with her only brother to impress people who would drop her the moment she became inconvenient. Her husband, rather than defending her to his family, had simply shrugged and said she should have thought about consequences before acting poorly. She called me that night, and for the first time in years, she sounded like the sister I'd grown up with. She apologized for everything: the seating arrangement, the dismissive comments, the way she'd let her husband's family change her into someone unrecognizable. I listened to her cry about feeling isolated and alone, about how she'd realized she'd pushed away the one person who'd always been there for her. She begged me to forgive her, promising things would go back to how they used to be. But some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt with just apologies. I told her I appreciated her call, but that trust, once broken, takes time to repair. I wasn't interested in being her backup plan when her new life fell apart. If she wanted a relationship with me, she'd need to prove she'd genuinely changed, not just reached out because she was lonely. She asked what she could do to make things right. I suggested she start by examining why she'd thought it was acceptable to treat me that way in the first place. Until she understood that, nothing else mattered. Update 3. 6 months after the birthday dinner, my sister's life had undergone a complete transformation. Her marriage, built on shallow foundations of social climbing and status seeking, crumbled when she realized her husband had only valued her as long as she helped elevate his position. When she finally stood up to him about his treatment of me and demanded he apologize, he'd laughed in her face. He'd told her that her family was beneath his standards anyway, and he'd only tolerated me because he thought she'd eventually cut ties completely. That conversation opened her eyes to what she'd become and what she'd lost in the process. She filed for divorce 3 months later. During the divorce proceedings, she learned that her husband had been systematically isolating her from everyone who might have supported her. He'd convinced her that her old friends weren't sophisticated enough, that her family wasn't successful enough, that she needed to upgrade every relationship in her life to match their new status. Without his influence, she began to see how manipulated she'd been. But she also acknowledged that she'd been a willing participant in pushing me away. The responsibility was hers, regardless of his influence. She started therapy and began the slow process of rebuilding her life. She moved back to our hometown, took a job at the local bank, and began reaching out to old friends she'd abandoned during her marriage. When she asked to meet for coffee, I agreed, but I made it clear this was just a conversation, not a reconciliation. We sat in the same cafe where we used to study together during her college years, and she told me about everything she'd lost, her marriage, her social circle, her sense of self. But she also talked about what she'd learned. She understood now that she'd treated me terribly not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I represented the life she thought she was too good for. She'd been embarrassed by her humble beginnings and had seen me as a reminder of where she came from. She showed me the divorce papers, which finalized just that week. Her ex-husband had kept the house, most of the assets, and his precious social status. She'd kept her dignity, which she'd realized was worth more than any of the material things she'd lost. I told her I was proud of her for recognizing her mistakes and taking steps to change. But I also made it clear that our relationship, if it ever recovered, would be built on mutual respect and equality. There would be no more hierarchy, no more judgment about success or status. She agreed immediately, and for the first time in years, I saw genuine sincerity in her eyes. Final update. A year has passed since that infamous birthday dinner, and my relationship with my sister has slowly begun to heal. It's not the same as it was before. Too much damage was done for things to simply return to how they were. But it's something new, built on a foundation of hard-won understanding and mutual respect. She's proven her commitment to change through consistent actions, not just words. When I had surgery last month, she was the first person at the hospital. When I got promoted at work, she was genuinely excited for my success without any hint of condescension or comparison to her own situation. Last weekend, she invited me to her new apartment for dinner, a modest place, nothing like the mansion she'd shared with her ex-husband. But it felt warm and genuine in a way that house never had. She'd made our grandmother's lasagna recipe, and when I arrived, there was one table set for 2 adults, with proper plates and real silverware. She handed me a small gift box, saying she had something that belonged to me. Inside was a simple bracelet that had belonged to our grandmother, one of the pieces from the collection I'd inherited. She explained that she'd bought it back from me, paying full appraised value, because she wanted to earn it rather than simply inherit it. I was touched by the gesture, but I told her to keep the money. The bracelet looked right on her wrist, and she'd earned it through the work she'd done on herself. We talked about our childhood, about the promises we'd made to always support each other, and about how we'd both lost sight of what family really meant. She apologized again, but this time it wasn't desperate or self-serving. It was simply acknowledgement of the pain she'd caused and her commitment to doing better. I won't pretend everything is perfect now. There are still moments when I remember how she looked at me that night, like I was something embarrassing she needed to hide. But I also see the woman who sat with me in the hospital when Mom had her heart attack, who helped me move into my first apartment, who used to split her last dollar with me when we were both struggling. People can change, but only if they're willing to do the hard work of examining themselves honestly. My sister has done that work, and while I'll never forget what happened, I've chosen to forgive. The vintage necklace she'd always wanted still sits in my jewelry box. Maybe someday, when I'm confident that the changes in her are permanent, I'll give it to her after all. But for now, it serves as a reminder that respect and love can't be assumed. They must be earned and maintained through our actions, not just our words. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who think they know us well enough to take our love for granted. The birthday dinner taught me that family isn't defined by blood alone, but by how we choose to treat each other. I'm grateful for that lesson, even though it came at such a painful cost. My sister learned it too, just in time to save what was left of our relationship. Not everyone gets that second chance, and neither of us is taking it for granted.